Your research actually specializes on sleep. It specializes on memory and on PTSD.
That's right.
Because you essentially look at what sleep deprivation can do as a result of PTSD. So actually your subjects are animals. And, what we do know is that pediatricians and mental health experts have said that the trauma of what is happening with these families being ripped apart, these children literally being taken out of the arms of their parents, can cause irreversible, lifelong damage. But can you explain what actually happens in the brain when a child goes through this trauma of being separated from their parents? And a lot of people might be saying, well, how do you see that if you're researching animals? So just explain those two things for us to start.
Sure. Well, actually, the data that I'm going to be talking about comes from animals and also, unfortunately, humans, because, people do go through chronic traumatic stressors and sometimes come into the emergency room, and then we can do measurements from them as well to see what is actually going on. But what happens initially is, and right away, is the stress hormones, cortisol and epinephrine, and in the brain, another hormone called norepinephrine, they get elevated. And this elevation, when it's sustained, affects the brain and the entire rest of the body.
When you say it affects the brain and does it affect it in a negative way, or is it just a physical thing?
Right. Initially, it's very good for fight or flight. And those are good responses. But when the body can't do either one of them, it can't fight and it can't flee, the body really sustains that as an impact. The body keeps score. And there's a really well-titled book by a psychiatrist who treated veterans of Vietnam for decades. And he wrote this book called The Body Keeps Score. It's something that we can't control cognitively. We can't do anything about. Every tissue in our body contains receptors for these hormones, and it prepares us for fighting or fleeing, but it then takes resources away from other important things like developing emotionally.
I got to tell you, Gina, when you said that, you have this reaction, fight or flight. We all feel it, right? You can feel it when you see a cat, if you're afraid of a cat.
That's right.
And then you know what to do, right?
Right.
But when you just said, when you do not have an option to either fight or to flee, and I just, like, my whole chest just was like, because it's like you're a child, you can't fight and there's nowhere for you to go. I mean, that in and of itself, that feeling of helplessness, I imagine has also has some impact on the brain.
Absolutely. If there is something you can do, that's really a good thing. That actually helps feed back onto the system that amps up these hormones and dampens them down. If there's something you can do to help yourself. And in fact, one of the key points for therapy for children is not necessarily drugs, but in fact, asking the child, wow, what did you do? How did you find the resources to cope with this? Making them feel empowered, making them feel powerful. That's really an important part of treating people who have gone through such trauma.
Right now, what we know of these recent numbers as a result of zero tolerance is that it's over 2,000 children have been separated from their parents at the border. There are advocates, there are medical doctors, colleagues of yours, Gina, who have actually said that these kinds of separations, these very kind of physical separations, and because of the conditions inside these detention camps, they're like prisons, they're called all of these things, but they really are, they're not good conditions.
Right.
And people are saying that, that actually this should be called child abuse. And, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen's response is that she says, these minors are very well taken care of and don't believe the press. And she says that the Department of Homeland Security is simply following the law.
These children have been traumatized in their trip up to the border. And the first thing that happens is we take away the one constant in their life that helps them buffer all of these horrible experiences. That's child abuse.
Can they get better? Is this permanent? Is it therapy? Is it going to be physical therapy? Is it just or are they all going to be impacted?
So this damage is permanent. And whether or not a child is resilient, and there are resilient people out there, but no matter how resilient you are, this is a blow. This is the equivalent of someone taking a hatchet to you and cutting off your leg. So those who are resilient may have only had one of their legs cut off, or only have, deep hatchet marks to their leg, but they are still damaged, and they will be more susceptible. Study after study shows that they'll be more susceptible to permanent and lifelong damage from future trauma.
Ugh. What do you mean by that? So you mean like, for example, because they've been exposed to this trauma, if they then have a small car accident, that it will actually feel like it was a much bigger
That's right.
experience because of the kind of built-on trauma?
That's right. They'll be more vulnerable to the effects of future traumas. It's a dose-dependent effect. So it's the number of traumas and it's the sustained nature of traumas. So it's kind of the area under the curve. The more trauma and the longer the trauma, the more likely that these children will suffer in the future from depression, from PTSD, from all kinds of other developmental related problems. Actually, even just myelination in the brain. Myelin is the protective covering around the wires of our brain, just like the insulation around the wires in our house. And that is going on, really strongly in children. And in the forebrain, which is our judgment and decision-making center, that goes on till about age 20, depending on if you're male or female. And what stress does to this myelin is it impairs that cladding, that cloaking of these axons. Myelin is the thing that's affected in multiple sclerosis. So we know that it's important for everything that our brain does. And when it's not there and it's weakened, then all of our cognitive processes that are not myelinated properly slow down and become dysfunctional. And that once that critical period for the myelination of that area closes, you can't go back. Right now, we have no way of going back and opening the critical period and myelinating it in the future. We just have to work around the impairment as best we can.